All right, so we left off. Captain Cook had collected all those objects. He's building a nest for himself in the icebox. And then Mrs. Popper suggests to Mr. Popper that he go take Captain Cook for a walk. Okay, and he asks for some clothesline that's like rope. So I think maybe what would he do with rope if he's going to go take his pet penguin for a walk? This chapter, chapter 8, is called Penguin's Promenade. Mr. Popper soon found that it was not so easy to take a penguin for a walk. Captain Cook did not care at first for the idea of being on a leash. So maybe he used that clothesline to make a leash. However, Mr. Popper was firm. He tied one end of the clothesline to the penguin's neck and the other to his own wrist. "Ork!" said Captain Cook indignantly. Still, he was a very reasonable sort of bird, and when he saw that protesting did him no good, he recovered his customary dignity and decided to let Mr. Popper lead him on their walk. Mr. Popper put on his best Sunday derby and opened the front door with Captain Cook waddling graciously behind him. "Gaw," said the penguin, stepping out onto the front porch and looking down at the steps. Mr. Popper gave him plenty of clothesline leash. "Gook," said Captain Cook. He raised his slippers and leaned forward bravely and tobogganed down the stairs on his stomach. Mr. Popper followed, though not in the same way. Captain Cook quickly got up on his feet again and strutted to the street ahead of Mr. Popper, with many quick turns of his head and pleasant comments at new scenes. So Captain Cook's never been outside before, so he's outside and he's looking around and he's kind of making all these excited noises. Down Proudfoot Avenue came a neighbor of the Poppers, Mrs. Callahan, with her arms full of groceries. She stared in astonishment when she saw Captain Cook and Mr. Popper, looking like a large penguin himself in his black long tailcoat. "Heavens have mercy on us," she claimed, as the bird began to investigate her striped stockings and her dress. "Is that an owl? Is it a goose?" "It isn't," said Mr. Popper, tipping his Sunday hat. "It's an Antarctic penguin, Mrs. Callahan." "Well, get it away from me," said Mrs. Callahan to Captain Cook. "Is it an anteater? What is it?" "It's not an anteater," explained Mr. Popper. "Antarctic. It was sent to me from the South Pole." "Take your South Pole goose away from me at once," said Mrs. Callahan. Mr. Popper pulled obediently on the clothesline while Captain Cook took apart pecking at Mrs. Callahan's socks and dress. "Heavens preserve us," said Mrs. Callahan. "I must stop in and see Mrs. Popper at once. I would have never believed it. I will be going on." "So will I," said Mr. Popper, as Captain Cook dragged him off to the street. So here's the picture. You can see how Mr. Popper kind of looks like a penguin, right? He's got his black coat and then the white pants and shirt, kind of like the penguin. He's got the black on the outside and then the white. And then you see Mrs. Callahan and Mr. Captain Cook is kind of pecking at her, and she's not happy. And she's very confused. So what is this animal? The next stop was at the drugstore at the corner of Proudfoot Avenue and Main Street. Here, Captain Cook insisted on looking over the display, which consisted of several open packages of shiny white crystals. These he eventually mistook for polar ice, for he began to peck at the window. Suddenly, a car wheeled to a nearby curb with a shriek of its brakes, and two men jumped out, one holding a camera. "This must be it," said the first young man to the other. "It's them, all right," said the second young man. The cameraman set up his tripod on the sidewalk. By this time, a small crowd had gathered around, and two men in white coats had even come out of the drugstore to watch. Captain Cook, however, was still too much interested in the window exhibit to bother to turn around. Are you Mr. Popper at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, right?" asked the second young man, pulling out his notebook from his pocket. "Yes," said Mr. Popper, realizing that his picture was about to be taken for the newspaper. These two young men had, as a matter of fact, heard about the strange bird from the policeman and had been on their way to the Popper's house to get an interview when they saw Captain Cook. "Hey, Pelican, turn around! Look here, little birdie," said the photographer. That's no pelican," said the other, who was the reporter. "Pelicans have a pouch in their bill." "What is it, like a dodo bird? Only dodos are extinct. This will make for an elegant picture if I can ever get her to turn around." "It's a penguin," said Mr. Popper proudly, "and his name is Captain Cook." "Gook," said the penguin, turning around now that they were talking about him. Spying the camera tripod, he walked around and examined it. He probably thinks it's some three-legged stork, said the photographer. This bird of yours, is it a he or a she? The public will want to know. Mr. Popper hesitated. Well, I call him Captain Cook, so I guess that makes it a he, said the reporter, writing that down in his notebook. Still curious, Captain Cook started walking around and around the tripod till the clothesline, the penguin, Mr. Popper, and the tripod were all tangled up. The tripod is what's holding up the camera. At the advice of one of the bystanders, the tangle was finally straightened out by Mr. Popper walking around the tripod 3 times in the opposite direction. At last, Captain Cook, standing still beside Mr. Popper, consented to pose for the picture. Mr. Popper straightened his tie and the cameraman snapped the picture. Captain Cook shut his eyes, and this was the way the picture appeared in the newspaper a few days later. One last question, said the reporter. Where did you get this strange bird? From Admiral Drake, the South Pole explorer. He sent him to me as a present. Yeah, said the reporter. Anyways, I guess it's a good story. The 2 men jumped into the car. Mr. Popper and Captain Cook continued their walk, with quite a crowd following them and asking questions. I want you to pause for a second and think. If you were just kind of outside running some errands, going to the store, and you saw someone walking a penguin on a leash, what would you be thinking? Okay, so these people are kind of following him, thinking like, what's going on, and asking him some questions. The crowd was getting so thick that in order to escape, Mr. Popper led Captain Cook into a barber shop. The man who kept the barber shop had, up to this time, been very good friends of Mr. Popper. Okay, so in this chapter, Mr. Popper is taking Captain Cook for a walk. They run into Miss Callahan, who's very confused and does not like Captain Cook. And then they run into the reporters, and there's going to be an article written about them. But the chapter ends, and I'm going to read it again. And I want you to listen really closely to this last sentence that I'm going to read. The crowd was getting so thick that in order to escape, Mr. Popper led Captain Cook into the barber shop. The man who kept the barber shop had, up to this point, been very good friends of Mr. Popper's. So they're saying that the man who owns the barber shop, until now, was good friends of Mr. Popper. Your question for question 8 is going to ask you to make a little bit of a prediction, okay? So it says referring to that last line. I'm going to read it one more time after I go through the question. What do you think this sentence means? And so I want you to kind of make a prediction. What's going to happen, okay? I'm going to read it one more time. The man who kept the barber shop had, up to this point, been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. What do you think that means? And what do you think might happen next in chapter 9? Okay, and I'll give you even a little bit more of a hint. Chapter 9 is called In the Barbershop. Okay, what do you think that sentence means? And what do you think might be about to happen next? The man who kept the barbershop had up to this point been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. All right, we'll tune back in on Thursday and see what happens.